All right, let's get started. Welcome everybody to our special lecture on Barack Obama and the idea of a left. We are very pleased to have Professor Eli Zaretsky with us this afternoon. Eli Zaretsky is a professor of history at the New School for Social Research in New York, where a lot of critical theory emanates these days and quite some time ago too. His special areas of research and writing are the cultural history and the history, analysis and critique of capitalism, and also about consumer culture and the connection between capitalism, consumer culture and psychoanalysis. He's edited the important book, The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, a classic work in immigration history by William Thomas, and written very interesting books like Capitalism, the Family and Personal Life, and quite recently a book on its English title is Secrets of the Soul, a social and cultural history of psychoanalysis. I bought that book because when I was in New York, I bought that book because I wanted to know what Eli is doing, and I was really sure that I would only read about the first 2 or 3 pages of the introduction, to get a sense of what it is about. And this happens very rarely to me, I must confess that I couldn't stop reading. In the end, I had really read it all, and I benefited a lot from it. And this is not just my impression, because the book has been a huge bestseller on the other side of the Atlantic as well as in Europe. It's available, of course, in German. It's called Freud's Jahrhundert. It's already very famous, but I'm totally impressed by the fact that it's also being translated into Chinese and Japanese. I have no idea how you've done that, but it's really impressive. And if you start, I really can recommend it very highly to you. But he's now working on something else. He's working on a new book, which the title is Why America Needs a Left. Of course, he means a political left. An historical argument for the insufficiency of liberalism. Actually, I think we just see the insufficiency of liberalism when you watch TV today. Now, we are all in Europe and elsewhere, of course, staring in fascination to our TV screens about the contemporary American struggle and debate between Barack Obama and McCain. I recently read Europe has voted already for the Europeans. It's no question. I think it's more than 2/3 in almost all countries who favor Barack Obama and not John McCain. So I hope you will convince us that Barack Obama is going to win that election. Anyway, the title is Barack Obama and the Idea of the Left. We are very pleased to have you here. Welcome, Eli Zaretsky.
Thank you. Can you hear me? The fact that the Berlin Wall collapsed exactly 200 years after the French Revolution did not escape the sharp eye of Francois Furet, the great French historian. Watching the uprisings on TV, Furet felt he was witnessing more than the end of a regime. He felt he was witnessing the end of an illusion. Born in 1789, not 1917, the illusion was the idea of a left. Driving that illusion, according to Furet, was, quote, hatred of the bourgeoisie, a social class viewed as all-powerful in economic terms, obsessed with money, but devoid of moral principle deep down inside. But what was hatred of the bourgeois? Only in appearance was it hatred of the other. It was, in fact, self-hatred. Today, he sighed happily, the revolution is finally over. The idea of another society is almost impossible to conceive of. Mercifully, quote, we are condemned to live in the world as it is. Today it would appear that Furet's euphoria was misplaced. Since 1989, there have been repeated demonstrations that the idea of a left is by no means finished. In Latin America, a self-proclaimed left has made spectacular gains since the election of Chavez in 1998. In Europe, social democracy probably remains hegemonic, even given Sarkozy's victory. Innovative human rights activities, the proliferation of international feminist networks, and the explicitly left Global Social Forum also demonstrate that the idea of a left has by no means run its course. Finally, in the United States, the Democratic Party is poised to win the presidency. Not surprisingly, given the twin disasters, Iraq and the economic crisis, which have utterly discredited the premises of American policy, not just Bush's policy, but American policies as they took shape after World War II. Yet, 1989 did bring into focus long-standing doubts concerning the project of a left, doubts that recent events have by no means dispelled. Thus, while a left proliferates in Latin America, it does so in societies that in many cases lack liberal institutions and a democratic culture. In the absence of liberal democracy, in what does the idea of a left consist? In Europe, ironically, the left's last big triumph was the defeat of the European Constitution, an event that derailed the development of an independent European foreign policy. Between the narrow economism of the French and Dutch lefts and a now discredited technocratic capitalist elite, the leftist intellectual faces real dilemmas. As to democracy movements, human rights activity, and feminism, it is not clear in what sense these belong to the left at all. The election of Barack Obama and of large Democratic majorities in Congress will not necessarily change this. Beginning in the 1970s, the Democrats in the United States dissolved their ties with poorer, working, and lower-class Americans, that is, with the majority of their fellow citizens. Under the slogan, "The era of big government is over," they eviscerated the one institution that protected the mass of people from the market. Taking a leaf from the party of big business, they denounced class struggle, so long as it arose from workers, blacks, and immigrants. Corruption, the destruction of pension and health plans, the turning over of the great industries to financial speculators, the transformation of cities into theme parks, privatization of education, subordination of scientific research to commerce, debasement of the public sphere. The Democrats either allowed this lethal tsunami of privatization to occur or actively promoted it under the rubric of the third way. The result, as Thomas Frank observed, was a French Revolution in reverse, one in which the sans-culottes poured down the streets, demanding more power for the aristocracy. Taken together, then, the difficulties of characterizing human rights activities, the confusions of the European left, and the near disappearance of the left in the United States suggest that the idea of a left needs to be rethought in more than a cursory manner. The problem did not begin. Is it a problem? Is it too loud? Is it echoing? Is it okay? It's okay? The problem did not begin in 1989. No one can deny that a period that produced feminism and gay liberation is a great period in the history of social justice. Nevertheless, what distinguishes our epoch is that for the first time in history, a secular transformation of capitalism, computerization, globalization, post-mortem, and so forth, was led by the right. At the same time, we have witnessed a basic shift in political culture from redistribution to recognition. However tendentious and inadequate, Feure's claim that the revolution is over reflected deep historical thought. This question is further underscored, the question of the continuing pertinence of the left, when we realize that the sense of the irrelevance of the left has largely been the product of the left itself. While it is true that since the 1970s there has been unprecedented financial and ideological support for right-wing thought, the left could never have been destroyed from the outside. The forgetting of the left, often taking the form of attempts to cut through a supposedly sterile left-right distinction or to replace an outmoded supposed economism, this forgetting has been generated by third-way theorists, advocates of the cultural turn, Kantians, Freudians, Foucauldians, feminists, historical revisionists, subaltern post-colonialists, and progressive sociologists. In other words, by the left itself. This paper is an attempt to reassert the validity, not so much of the left as of the idea of a left. It argues that the left-right dichotomy has an integrity of its own, one that can not be reduced to such dichotomies as socialism versus capitalism or bourgeoisie versus proletariat. It argues that the left-right dichotomy obscures a more fundamental relationship, that between large popular forces, such as the Democratic Party in the United States, and the smaller, dispersed, and diverse, but intellectually coherent and morally insistent forces of the left. It also argues that while the left long ago outgrew the idea of a working class revolution, whether it fully realized this or not, no social movement that fails to place an explicitly critical stance toward capitalism, not a simple negation, at the center of its thought deserves the appellation left. Finally, it argues that liberal politics is spineless without a left, while a left, and by liberal I mean broadly, I don't necessarily mean neoliberal, I mean broadly liberal, while a left without liberalism will ultimately be marginal, sectarian, and authoritarian. But before proceeding, I need to address a prior question. What is meant by the idea of a left? By the idea of a left, I mean the concept of a left, not any particular left, not the history of the left, but rather the concept itself. In using the term concept, I mean to make three related points. First, I want to suggest that there's something necessary or universal about the left. In other words, that in order to think about society or history at all, we need such a concept. Second, I mean to distinguish the concept from its historical expressions, for example, its incarnations in organizations, newspapers, journals, publishing houses, and the like. The idea of a left is different from a collection of protest movements, each organized around a particular problem, such as multiculturalism, global warming, healthcare, and so forth. Third, I mean to distinguish the critical, intellectual, and consciousness-raising role of the left from its role in seeking and wielding political power. The idea of a left is inseparable from the idea of an intellectual. Gaining power does not define the left. Indeed, when a left gains power, a left may be especially needed. When the idea of a left is considered at this level of generality, it becomes immediately clear that the idea will never become obsolete or irrelevant. To be on the left involves a kind of existential stance, intermediate between the biologically given and the path-dependent or historical. Deriving from the situation of the body in nature, the left-right dichotomy was originally an attempt to ground authority in nature. In every society, the symbols of order, the important ministers, the bishops of the church, the wealthy patrons sit on the right, while the lesser forces sit on the left. The right symbolizes dominance, authority, and God. The left symbolizes rebellion, danger, and evil. Consider the words right, recht, and droit versus maladroit, gauche, and sinister. In Mark, Gospel of Mark, God says, I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power. In Milton, the rebellious angels, Lucifer, and his minions are on the left. Robert Hertz, the anthropologist, summarizes, the right hand is the model and symbol of all aristocracies, the left hand of all plebeians. But while the universal subordination of the left, including the left hand, reflects a universal attempt to ground social power, we also mean something different when we speak of the modern idea of a left. The modern idea is almost mythically connected to the French Revolution. In part, this is because the Revolution, properly conceived so that it includes the Americas, Bengal, and the Middle East, in part, was the first world event. But also because the French Revolution provided the first site, physical site, on which the idea of the left was enacted. During the Revolution, which famously included theatrical, redemptive, and other political elements, horizontality replaced verticality. The Sun King and the Catholic hierarchy gave way to patriotic festivals which took place in open spaces so that everyone was on the same level and could see everyone else. It was in this new horizontal space that the modern left-right dichotomy was born. During the seating of the National Assembly in 1789, the nobility sat on the president's right, and the Third Estate sat on the left. The real importance of the distinction emerged gradually as the left came to represent the social revolution, the right the strictly political revolution. After the defeat of Napoleon, the left-right distinction spread with the idea of parliamentary or representative democracies. As Jean Lapence has noted, being visual and spatial, the left-right dichotomy was immediately understandable and immediately translatable across cultures. The fact that a distinctively modern idea of a left was born with the French Revolution has to be qualified in two respects. To begin with, many of the ideas we identify with the left first appear not with the French Revolution, but earlier with the Protestant revolutions 1 or 2 centuries before. This is especially true of the core liberal value of freedom of conscience. Nevertheless, the English and the Dutch did not seek to universalize their revolution in the way that the French did, and indeed the whole concept of an English revolution, Dutch revolution, and American revolution was only formulated retrospectively after 1789. Second, what we call the French Revolution has to be seen as part of the expression of a global process. The Haitian Revolution had as much impact in the New World as the French Revolution had in Europe. Anti-slavery is as central to the birth of the modern idea of a left as the abolition of feudalism. Many ideals were born during the age of the democratic revolutions that the idea of a left implies and must employ. These include political ideals such as individual freedom, equality before the law, limitations on the state, political democracy, and so forth, as well as cultural ideals such as personal autonomy and the self-grounding character of what is often termed modernity. At first glance, none of these require a left. The idea of a left became relevant as well as necessary for 3 reasons. It just occurred to me that you may have been expecting a talk completely on Barack Obama. I will get to Barack Obama at the end of the talk. I just realized that. The idea of a left is necessary as distinguished from from a whole set of modern values for 3 reasons. First, because the commitment to modern ideals of freedom has in fact been so shallow, so compromised, and so easily abandoned in the face of short-term opportunities and practical constraints that society developed a need for a permanent body of extremists, risk-takers, and scolds. In Michael Walzer's language, referring to the 17th century Puritans, modern politics needs saints, characterized by an uncompromising and sustained commitment to a political ideal, which other men called hypocrisy, and by a pattern of rigorous and systematic labor in pursuit of that ideal, which other men called meddlesomeness. This might be called the sociological and psychological reason for the left. Without a left, a combination of powerful interests, corruption, and apathy would be sure to prevail. Indeed, it may just be that a certain minority of the species, at least under modern conditions, finds injustice, humiliation, or socially imposed pain intolerable. I know people like that, and I am one of them. Such individuals constitute an important basis for the left. Alexis de Tocqueville, visiting the U.S. 30 years before the Civil War, was, quote, astonished by the equanimity, indifference, and moral carelessness with which Americans managed to live with slavery. The abolitionists did not share that indifference, and they felt so strongly about it, they made the indifference impossible for others, creating the space within which Lincoln operated. The second reason for a left is conceptual. Whereas a powerful liberal tradition advances the cause of freedom, that cause is an ambiguous one. Not just the slaves, but also the slave owners fought for freedom. In the latter case, the freedom to dispose of their property as they saw fit. A left is necessary, in other words, because the struggle for political rights and cultural emancipation is not sufficient. There is also a need for social equality. Implicit in the shift from verticality to horizontality, the left's radical conception of equality has been summarized by Stephen Luce. Quote, what unifies the left as a tradition across time and space is its very rejection of the symbolic hierarchy and the inevitability of the inequalities it sanctifies. What this suggests is that the left denotes a tradition and a project which found its first clear expression in the Enlightenment and which puts in question sacred principles of social order, contests unjustifiable but remediable inequalities of status, rights, powers, and condition, and seeks to eliminate them through political action. Its distinctive core commitment is to a demanding answer to the question of what equality means and implies. Luke's conception of equality is powerful, but it conflates two different implications of the term. On the one hand, we can envision a society of equals, and we can seek to remedy inequalities, for example, through redistribution, or through the elimination of discrimination, or through affirmative action. This conception of equality remains within a liberal paradigm insofar as it's based on a commitment to equal worth of individuals. However, there is a second implication of the term equality. The term at least suggests such ideals as solidarity, community, commensality. This is equality in the Republican sense. Every individual feels equal to every other individual in the sense that they feel identified with them. The second individual implication of equality has often been at tension with individual rights. This is the famous tension between freedom and equality, or between liberalism and the left. This tension is a positive one. It should not be resolved. The left adds to the liberal ideal of freedom the idea that individuals derive their individuality from a common shared project. Ultimately, in other words, the left stands for a sense of the unity of the human species in a way that the liberal ideal of the equal worth of all individuals does not, the unity of the species. The left did not create the call for equality. Rather, this call arises from social movements, such as the labor movement, African American freedom movement, or the women's movement. The history of these movements reveals that the call for equality changes historically, often in unpredictable ways. As examples, consider the abolition of slavery, a form of labor that was essentially unquestioned for thousands of years, or gay liberation, a demand that was initially unimaginable. Although social movements that demand equality create new values, often surprising ones, they are not necessarily themselves on the left, although they may be. The left's job is not to create these movements, but to respond to them. At the same time, the left has the responsibility of interpreting these movements in terms of an overall telos of equality, conceptualizing their relation to other movements and critiquing them from that point of view. In Marx's formulation, the left is self-clarification of the struggles and wishes of the age. The left is not only in dialogue with movements demanding equality, it responds to charismatic upheavals, such as those associated with art, sexuality, and religion. The abolitionists, for example, were an outgrowth of the religious revivals of the 1820s and 30s. The New York intellectuals of the 1950s were trying to fashion a politics with psychoanalysis at its center. The New Left had a close but ambivalent relation to the hippies. Without a relation to extra-political cultural movements, the left can be reduced to a running critique of liberalism, one that is always trying to push liberalism beyond its limits, but which creates no new values of its own. Without a left, cultural or transgressive radicalism can disintegrate into entertainment, an artifact of an absorptive mass culture. The relation of the left to other social movements is central to clarifying its core idea or concept. The left always combines two elements. On the one hand, it seeks to push liberal ideals of freedom and equal worth to their fullest extent. On the other hand, it combines liberal ideals with utopian, romantic, aesthetic, and communitarian impulses, of which it may be critical, but from which it derives its inspiration. The left's commitment to a searching ideal of equality points to a basic asymmetry in the relation of left and right. The left is a protest against the established order. The right is a response to the left. Without the left, the right would not exist, as one can see when one considers the founding text of modern conservatism, Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. It's a response. The point has been disputed. For Luke's, for example, the left-right distinction implies pluralism. In other words, a left and a right at all times. He says the left and right dichotomize the political space, and so forth. However, it's striking that when we get a right that has genuine intellectual force and charisma, as we got in the United States in the 1970s, it necessarily dresses itself up in the leftist vernacular of protest, discontent, minority voice, and exclusion. The asymmetric character of the left-right dichotomy is sufficient to refute the idea that we no longer need a left. The left's commitment to equality, both because it deepens individual rights and because it deepens the sense of a common project, common human project, is a driving force of social progress, intimately linked to all creativity, discontent, and unhappiness. The right, by contrast, is most helpfully conceived of as a variety of responses to the left. The really vital relationship in modern history, then, the one that drives its political dynamic, is not the relation between left and right, but rather between the left and the classical liberal and Republican doctrines that emerged during the seedbed of modern democratic politics, going back to the English Civil Wars of the 17th century. For many liberals, Ronald Dworkin and Michael Walzer might serve as examples. The advance of equality is essentially a matter of pushing such liberal principles as equal respect to their extreme. For such liberals, liberalism doesn't need a left superego to breathe down its neck. Liberalism can supply its own superego. Thank you. The Republican tradition also has its left variants, exemplified by Quentin Skinner. But whereas liberalism leads logically to an understanding of equality in terms of distribution of material, cultural, and political resources among individuals, and republicanism stresses equal participation and shared purpose in a political community, a left stresses equality and participation in the social and economic and cultural bases of life as a whole. One can observe the tension between liberalism and the left in the earliest forms of modern politics. Consider Christopher Hill's observation concerning the English Civil War. Quote, "There were two revolutions in mid-17th century England. The one which succeeded established the sacred rights of property, abolition of feudal tenure, no arbitrary taxation, gave political power to the propertied, sovereignty of Parliament and common law, and removed all impediments to the triumph of the ideology of men of property, the Protestant ethic. There was, however, another revolution which never happened, although from time to time it threatened. This might have established communal property, a far wider democracy in political and legal institutions, might have disestablished the state church and rejected or criticized the Protestant ethic." Hill's remarks confirm that the interdependence of liberalism and the left and the tension between them has deep historical roots. 4 centuries ago, the founders of modern liberal thought, such as Locke, were attacking extremist utopian sects such as the Diggers and Levelers. But while figures like Locke established the principles of liberty by which we still orient ourselves, a nagging radical tradition persisted, seeking to push bourgeois culture and democratic politics beyond its self-imposed limits. The radical sects of 17th century England differed among themselves, but they all put forth first economic demands, responding to the enclosures or privatization of rural England, insisting that we, who are called the common people, as the Diggers said, must manure and work on the common land. Political demands, Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army, and cultural demands centered on the critique of the family and on women's equality and on so-called true and pure, undefiled religion. Our term radical comes from Cromwell, and it means those with the root of the matter, that is to say, God, for Cromwell, in them. A left is necessary, then, summarizing, first, because apathy, self-interest, and opportunism typically triumph over the commitment to freedom or equality, and second, because the liberal tradition itself has certain necessary aporia or restrictions. But these limitations must themselves be explained. In this regard, Karl Marx's explanation, namely that the democratic revolutions were bourgeois revolutions and thus self-limiting, is both inadequate and unavoidable. Any left must find a coherent successor to Marx's explanation, because the most important task of the left is that of enlightening social movements as to the deep social structures that block the realization of their aspirations. In Injustice, Barrington Moore contrasts two forms of critique. The first, he says, is anger at the failure of authority to live up to its obligations, we see this today, to keep its word and faith with the subjects. This critique, more rights, toppled thrones, yet it is inherently limited. Essentially, it accepts the existence of hierarchy and authority while attempting to make it conform to an idealized pattern. The second form of criticism, the really subversive form, begins when people ask whether a specific social function needs to be performed at all, whether kings, priests, capitalists, or revolutionary bureaucrats may not be something human society could do without. It's the second form of critique that distinguishes the modern idea of the left. I said before that forgetting, at the beginning of my paper, I said that the forgetting of the idea of the left has been a loss. At the same time, there has been a great gain since the 1960s, clarifying the meaning of the idea of revolution and separating and distinguishing the idea of a revolution from the idea of a left. Marx, as we know, interpreted the French Revolution as a bourgeois revolution, and he anticipated that eventually there would be a socialist revolution that would fulfill the ideals of the limited revolution associated with the bourgeoisie. Feure's criticism starts from his criticism of Marx. Feuret said that French Revolution should not be understood as a bourgeois revolution, but rather as the birth of modern politics. And for Feuret, that was enough to refute the idea of a left. And what I've tried to argue in this paper is that if we understand the French Revolution in Feuret's sense as creating modern politics, that's exactly why we need, and the way in which we need a left. In other words, Feuret's reading, the reinterpretation of the French Revolution, validates the idea of a left, but it's the idea of the left as a political and cultural tendency. It also validates, in a way, the original French idea of revolution. Not revolution in the sense that Marx made it, of the replacement of one social class of another. Revolution as a way of thinking, a way that tries to bring the different demands of social justice into relation with one another, and that allows for reflection on those demands. The left arose along with the abolition of the monarchy, when many believed that reason would replace the divine right of kings. The strength of the left lies in its ability to think rationally and explain its thinking in a comprehensible, popular, and dialogic manner. Insofar as it simply identifies with popular forces, it's doomed. At the same time, the left cannot be reduced to the intellect. It incorporates values and practices embodied in people's lives. It has continuity over the generations. Finally, a word about what I've said in relation to Barack Obama. What is truly great about Obama, and I don't use that word lightly, he may really be great, is the way that Obama articulated during the primary what Rousseau called the general will. And Rousseau distinguished the general will from what Rousseau called the will of all. The general will are those values of freedom and equality and so forth, which once did define American identity, which at various points in American history, people did struggle to make those the core values of the United States. The will of all is a coalition of different forces, or a bringing together of different demands, as we saw, for example, in Obama's rivals, Hillary Clinton and John Edwards, putting together different demands, but not speaking to the core question. This was then the source of Obama's extraordinary power, the fact of going back to this question of the general will, to which I think the idea of a left is always connected, certainly in the United States. At the same time, what I'm trying to say in this paper is that an Obama presidency, no matter how great the victory may well be in about a month, cannot really succeed over the long term unless a robust and independent left develops in the United States. And the reason for this is the magnitude, the probable magnitude of the crisis that the United States is going in today. It was a crisis that involves the nation in having to define its own identity, and it's probably comparable to the other two great crises at which the United States developed a left, and these are the Civil War and the Great Depression. And consider, insofar as the American Civil War stood for not just the abolition of slavery, but stood for racial equality, a core principle, which we see how important this is today in the Obama movement. It was not because of Lincoln. It was to some extent because of Lincoln, but it was because of the abolitionists. It was because there was an independent left that stood for equality and fought for the question of equality above and beyond the question of slavery, the question of the extension of slavery, the question of the preservation of unity. It stood for that principle in that case of racial equality. And it's the same thing that happened during the New Deal in the United States. Insofar as the New Deal stood for something beyond recovery from the Depression, beyond economic growth again, insofar as it stood there, that is for a principle of social equality, it was because there was a left during the 1930s, and it's going to be the same thing in terms of an Obama presidency. So just as it's impossible to give an account of the Civil War or the New Deal without an important role assigned to the left, so it's impossible to explain the events of recent modern American history, many of them appalling events, in terms of what the United States has been through and what the United States has done. We can't explain these events unless we take account not of a left, but the absence of a left in the United States. A people without a left is like an individual who has no memory. It becomes confused and disorganized, and that is what happened to the American people in recent years. Their confusion, in my view, reflected the absence or weakness of a left. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Eli, for these fascinating insights into the psychology of political thinking. We have a few minutes left for questions. You can, of course, ask them in German or in English, as you like. Have you got a microphone? Yes. Okay. Are there anything you always wanted to know about left psychology or Barack Obama?
Do you see a real chance for developing left in the United States? Because, well, at the end you have said that the United States need a left, and the war in Iraq was a consequence of not having a left. But to what extent, as a social analyst, you see developing new roots of more moral sensibility or more moral cohesion in the United States?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm probably pretty pessimistic about that. I'm not. I'm not a prognosticator, and I understand much better the conditions under which lefts developed and a tradition of the left developed in the past, and it may just be that a rebirth of a left in our time will be more global and not national. My own sense, but you never know. I mean, that's part of what I'm trying to say is that who would ever have expected Obama? I mean, Obama appears like a miracle in American politics, completely unprepared for and completely, in my view, to a great extent, unmerited, given the political culture of the United States in recent years. I think your question is a good one.
All right. Are there any other questions?
Oh, come on.
Maybe I can just say it. You mentioned at the end of your talk that there was a left in the United States in the 1930s.
Yes.
Well, when I first saw the title of your talk, I was thinking, I hope the undecided voters don't see it, because they think that Obama is leftist, they may not vote.
Yeah.
The reputation of being left in the United States is so negatively
Right.
tainted.
Yeah.
In the 1950s, it seems to me the left was wiped out through this intensive campaign.
Yeah.
And to bring that back, it's the same question in other words. But one of the forces in the United States that really kind of wiped out a left that did exist in the 1930s is their really hope of overcoming this huge propaganda assault on the legitimacy of the left.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree, and that wiping out of the left, as I said at the beginning of my paper, to a great extent, it was really, to a great extent, it was something that the left did to itself, because you're right that after World War II, basically I look at the whole period of the Cold War as a reaction against the 1930s and the principles of social democracy and social justice that were sort of established globally in the 30s and 40s. And I think that American history since then, to a great extent, there was a huge pushback against that, and I think the Cold War has to be understood in that context. Of course, anti-communism, but the Cold War was a lot more than a critique of communism. And the wiping out of the whole history of the left and the whole heritage and the centrality that the left, the overlap between the American project, because it is a nation that's founded on ideas, and it is a nation that has really struggled over the very few things. It's a very decentralized and diverse nation that has struggled, that has had a series of struggles over the core meaning of the very few things that define it, like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but especially the Declaration of Independence. Lincoln trying to re-understand the Declaration of Independence as a project, and this is what Obama goes back to. But even the ferocity of the attempt to wipe out the whole meaning of social equality that was associated with the gains that I think were really made during the 1930s and 40s, even the ferocity, it didn't really succeed, because then in the 1960s and 70s you got a huge explosion of left forces. And the real question for me is why those forces have not been able, and this is the thrust of my paper, to see the continuity between themselves and the historical left. That's what I'm trying to get at in the paper. And that's why I think it's important not just to equate the left with the social democratic moment, which was, incredibly important and we see every day as we see the financial collapse and the extraordinary extent of it, which we don't really know yet, how massive it is. We see, how important those gains of the 30s and 40s were. But those really do not define the left. As I said in the paper, in the United States, part of the problem in understanding the left is that the idea of a left is a very European idea, because you have to have left, right, center. You have the parliamentary system. We don't have that in the United States. We have a two-party system. We have a left. And we have a history of the left, and it's a history that converges, and it's a very rich history. It's not necessarily a party history and so forth, and it's a history that has a huge overlap with the European history and divergence from it, and so forth. But our left really goes back centrally, and here again you see the fantastic importance of the Obama presidency. Our left is really a left whose origin is in anti-slavery. Not in socialism. And socialism is a moment in the history of the left. It doesn't define the project.
All right.
You can ask in German, because Hartmut can translate.
Well, okay, maybe there's time for one more question. Okay, so I'm sure we'll all follow very closely the future of the American left, particularly in November. But thank you very much, Eli Zaretsky, once again for sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks a lot.